Sorry. Here we are. Welcome again to Theories of Reality. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and we're continuing to discuss arguments for and against the existence of God. So we're going to start on the cosmological argument today. I've put all the arguments in Moodle. Let's see, where'd they move Moodle? Here it is. Why don't they use the cool Moodle yoga? The cool Moodle logo. Was that?
He had us.
Oh,
What are you guys yakking about over
He
there?
had us switch spots.
Yeah, we switched
because
spots.
I was blocking him in the camera.
Ah. Perish the thought. Okay. So last time we talked about the ontological argument, and most people think the ontological argument sucks. And so it's not very intuitive. It seems to play games with the concept of existence, and it uses existence in this sort of I don't know, you'd say it's kind of like Platonic metaphysics. Like Plato has this thing, which we didn't talk about in this class, but Plato is probably the most famous for his so-called theory of forms. So Plato's idea, and this probably wasn't an idea of Socrates, but Plato's idea is that there's this realm of, a kind of a spiritual realm of ideas that's more real than physical objects. So like he would say, like there's the form or the idea or the concept of man. And the concept of man sort of creates the individual men, or humanity, if you like, right? So there's this sort of ideal concept existing in an ethereal realm called the concept of humanity, and it is what gives existence to all the individual people. In the same sense that, say, a person who's casting a shadow creates that shadow. So he has this sort of chain of being where you have the kind of like the realm of shadows and reflections and things that are kind of sort of real but not really, and then you have physical objects which are a little more real, and then you have the spiritual world which is super real. And the people in the medieval period kind of picked up on this idea of degrees of reality. So like if I say, I don't know, does Sherlock Holmes exist, like last time? And you could say, well, he exists as a fictional character, right? So he kind of exists, but he kind of doesn't. So, but I think philosophers would say, most philosophers today would say that, existing as a fictional character isn't really existing. That, Sherlock Holmes is an idea, and so that's different than a physical object existing. So things either exist or they don't, according to most philosophers today. So, but this idea that a thing can exist more than something else, or that a thing can have necessary existence, or things that most philosophers question. And then there's, most people think that Kant's criticism is definitive, because Anselm wants to say that a real God is greater than an imaginary God. So therefore, if you define God as the greatest being imaginable, he exists by definition, because of course a real God is greater than an imaginary God. And what Kant says is basically there aren't two concepts, the concepts of a real God and the concepts of an imaginary God. There's just the concept of God. And then there's a separate question about whether God exists or not. You can't talk about existence as sort of being a quality of a concept, right? So here's the real God and the imaginary God, and the concepts are exactly the same, except for the real God has the quality of existence, because existence isn't a quality. It's different than being omnipotent and omniscient and omnibenevolent, which is being completely good, being eternal, right? Those are all qualities of God. They're part of the concept of God. But existence isn't something you could stick in there along with being all powerful or all-knowing. It's a different kind of thing. It's not part of the concept. What existence is it's whether or not that concept is it has an instance in reality. In other words, whether it's embodied or manifested in the real world. So if you're talking about Sherlock Holmes, like existence isn't one of his qualities, like wearing a deerstalker cap or smoking a pipe. It's or being a cocaine addict in the stories, but not the movies. Although I don't know what they did with I can't remember with the Robert Downey Jr. version. It seems like it would be like typecasting, right, for Robert Downey Jr. Anyway, so so that's so most people think that the ontological argument is logically flawed in all kinds of ways. And as far as like your man in the street, you tell them the ontological argument, and they screw up their face and go, huh? That doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't really have an intuitive cachet with like your average person. And it's just the sort of thing that a medieval monk spends a lot of time in the cloister praying and thinking about stuff, and too much time on his hands comes up with. And again, apart from like some really devoted Catholics in Notre Dame that are sure that they can figure out a way to make it work and defend it against all comers, most philosophers look askance at the ontological argument. I think most people think it's kind of a loser. But I don't know, anybody have a contrary opinion? Now that I've poisoned the well. The ontological argument is a complete train wreck. Anybody want to defend it? This is like in some of my philosophy grad classes where it's, you're talking about some hot button issue, and I'm just sitting there and smiling and nodding my head. Not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. Okay. I'll wait until I'm back teaching political science. Then I can say whatever I want in my own class. And try to encourage students, and I hope everyone in this class, feel free to disagree, argue, bring up contrary points. The exams are objective, and they're just based on what we do in class. And sometimes I might add the caveat, as according to information presented in the readings or by the instructor in class or something. So you're free to believe. If you have free will, you're free to believe whatever you like. But you just have to remember what the different theories are for the exam. And I try to give these theories sort of the best, I try to give them the best argument in favor of them. And then we can, I dissect them and bash them as much as I can too. So I try to give equal treatment. I would say a couple of things are sort of basic, I would say relativism is kind of foundational because, foundational in the sense that it's a crappy theory and it causes lots of, it's probably the most, well, I don't know, I would say, it's hard to say. I was going to say that relativism is probably the philosophical view that has caused the most mischief in the history of the world. But maybe there's some other contenders there. But at least it's the most philosophically problematic because you can't really do real philosophy if you're a relativist. And that's why some of these people that pose as philosophers really belong in the literature department or something, or maybe political science. And so that's basic. But the rest of the stuff, you have pro and con arguments, and we try to go through them, and I try to point out the strengths and the weaknesses. And these aren't just, my own take. Sometimes I have my own particular take, or I come up with a little, funny example or something. But most of this represents, the, history of philosophers throughout history and what they've said about the arguments. Okay, so we're coming to the cosmological argument. So let's see if this one does a little better. This is one with a little bit of intuitive force behind it. So we're going to look at Thomas Aquinas's Aquinas has not one, not two, not three, but five ways to prove the existence of God. So the first three ways are what's called the cosmological argument. And then way number 4 is it's a version of the design argument. I think maybe actually 4 is, no, 4, the one from gradation of being, it's a version of the ontological argument, and 5 is a version of the design argument. So we're going to look at ways 1 through 3 here. Even though I gave you all 5, I just wanted you to see the other 2. You can say, oh, okay, that's I can see that's kind of like Anselm's argument, like this idea that the gradation of being, again, that's that Plato idea, right? This, and you know, Aquinas is, even though Aquinas loves Aristotle, he's still under the spell of Plato as well, with this sort of this concept of the gradation of being, that things have more or less existence, and that existence is sort of something you can quantify a thing as having more or less of, as opposed to this more common sense idea before your mind's ruined by reading Plato, that either something exists or it doesn't exist. But you know, philosophers were under the spell of this idea of the great chain of being, and the gradation of being, that there's this sort of scale of how much a thing exists. And so you see that in Aquinas too, in I believe it's the 4th way. And the 5th way is this idea of the fitting of ends to means, of the design of the world. That's more like that's the design argument, which we'll talk about next week. As you may have noticed in our schedule, we're a little behind. We're like a class behind for the snow day. Okay, so the first 2 ways of those 3 ways are the what's called the causal argument. So here's basically it says everything that exists has a cause, therefore the universe itself must have a cause. What was it that created the universe? Well, whatever that is, we're going to call that God. So and you think about this question, you could say, well, and people often say this when talking about the existence of God. They'll say, well, how you don't believe in God? How did the world get here? What created us? What, you believe in the Big Bang? Okay, well, what caused the Big Bang? And so the causal argument says that when the fact of the existence of the universe requires an explanation, and so the universe must have come from something. Whatever that something is the creator of the universe. And what do we mean by creator of the universe? Well, that's just God, right? God is whatever, and we might not know God's nature, but we know that God exists because God is necessary to explain the existence of the universe. And so that, let's see, let me see a moment here. What I got here. Oh, alrighty. Before we go any farther, this Aquinas' the cosmological argument, and including Aquinas' version, is an a posteriori argument. So remember last time we talked about Anselm's argument is an a priori argument, an argument just based on concepts. So you'd say, reporters are liberal, therefore you'd expect the media to be liberal, right? Something like that. Or the news is a business, therefore you'd expect the news coverage to be conservative and to be pro-business. And it turns out that the first of those is true. The second of those it turns out to be false, at least in the broad general way. And it's actually because I think the people that control the content in the news tend to be the reporters, and the people that the money people don't pay much attention to ideological concept, unless like some subsidiary of theirs is being is going to get raked over the coals. Like they had, I know that I think Disney and ABC merged, and I think ABC's 2020 was going to do a thing on pedophiles at Disneyland, and that story just got spiked, faster than you can say Bob's your uncle. It was just, no, we're not going to put that on. So, stuff like that happens, but you have to have a particular interest. But like if you can have these big news corporations, and you just see like articles bashing business, bashing free market capitalism left and right. So this just shows there's a big limit to a priori arguments. And this is something you see in social science quite a bit. People have ideological commitments or they have like their conceptual systems, and then they expect the world to sort of fit into them, right? And so they have this sort of theory, and then they interpret everything according to this theory. And often, if you do like the empirical study, you find out that the theory doesn't work, right? So really using your senses and doing investigation is important to verify any idea. So you always want to do the empirical work. So an a posteriori argument is an argument based on observation. This is kind of weird, what's the observation here? That the universe exists? That's sort of a weird way of thinking about like using your senses. You look around, oh look, the world exists. You can also put it though in terms of like cause and effect. So you see, this is the way he says it's not just the universe exists. You say, well, maybe the universe didn't come from anything. But then Aquinas says that this idea that you can't get, that everything comes from something else is an observational idea. So what do you think about that? Do we know that you can't get something from nothing? Is that something that we learn through experience, or is that an a priori idea, that you can't get something from nothing, that everything that exists was caused by something else, caused to exist by something else? Any thoughts about that?
The only thing I can think of is like virtual particles in quantum vacuums. I think that's about it. But that's kind of evidence-based.
Yeah, so there, I suppose there's,
Yeah, but even
you
then,
have particles that seem to appear out of nowhere,
yeah,
and so people say, look, there's something
Yeah.
from nothing.
you can
But-
say it's just coming from somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, I think but this is where like this, multiple worlds,
Yeah,
metaphysics comes in, right?
String theory. Yeah.
Yeah,
It kind of seems hard too, like wouldn't God himself have to also have a beginning
Yeah.
and creation, therefore God has a God, and like that's just not gonna stop ever.
Yeah.
Everything has a beginning, if something has to have a beginning, and we call that God, well God had to have a beginning. But if God just always was and always could be, like so could just the bare fact of the universe and the Big Bang. Like if we're gonna give God that special case of not needing a beginning, why can't we just give that to our universe as it is?
yeah. It's a good question. So let me come back to my PowerPoint. Or my, let's see, what do I just hide this thing. I call it my starboard. So you could say like, who made God and who made God, right? If you say, well, who made God? Oh, well, God did. The one that, so if God, so you'd say like, okay, who made God? Well, some other God. Well, who made that God? Right? You just go on forever.
Or on the timeline.
Where are we at?
Because could God have made himself before he was made?
So there's a question, and that's what Aquinas considers these things. So he says, like, what? There's only like a few different ways this could happen. So, let's see. How did the universe get here? And you can't get something from nothing. This is kind of an interesting question about whether this is really an observation or not. Is this, empirical or a priori? Let's put that question. I mean, Aquinas thinks it is. Oops, sorry, a posteriori. But I think you might say, well, no, it's something that you know, like, just rationally. It's like if something popped into existence. Just imagine, like, something like a balloon, right? A red balloon pops up and just is floating in the air in front of us. You can say, well, where'd that come from? And I say, well, maybe it didn't come from anywhere. Maybe it just popped into existence for no particular reason. And it seems like that you'd always want to figure out like what caused that balloon to come into existence. You wouldn't say, well, maybe it just sort of happened, right? That seems sort of anti-scientific and anti-rational. Now, Aquinas might say, well, the reason you think that is because you've been habituated through experience, that you learn through experience, that by seeing things that come from other things. But that seems kind of weak. It seems like even when your mind starts developing, you're always looking for why something happened. That's just part of being a reasoning being. So, but I'll just leave that hanging for a minute. A posteriori. Okay.
Yeah, is it even possible to think your way out of the universe in that sense? Like, we're just always gonna go on a grander scale of where did this come from and where did that come from? Like, where did this space come from that we have everything inside of? Why is the vacuum the vacuum?
Yeah. And so I think what Aquinas would say is that you can, okay, suppose whatever created the universe has a cause. Well, then there's got to be a cause before that, and cause before that, and just go on to infinity. But what Aquinas says is that you have a choice of either an infinite regress, or you have an uncaused cause. And he says, this is your choice. This is like a dilemma argument. So either you choose, actually it's disjunctive syllogism. I misspoke. So this is a disjunctive syllogism. You say there's these two choices. It's not one, therefore it has to be the other. And these are only two choices. So you think about if whatever made these universe has a cause, well then that cause either has a cause or it doesn't, and that cause either has a cause or it doesn't. And you just go, so either you just go back to infinity, or at some point you stop, and there's an uncaused cause, which itself is not caused. And he says that an infinite regress of causes is absurd, that it doesn't make any sense. And this is just, absurd or ridiculous or nonsensical. So therefore, there must be an uncaused cause, which is the genesis of all subsequent causes. So that's his argument. So two premises here. One is that infinite regress of causes is impossible, or not. Maybe not that impossible is too strong a word. Absurd. He says it doesn't make any sense. So see, what do you think about that? This idea of an infinite regress of causes.
It's easier to handle mentally than the uncaused cause.
Really, most people think it's the opposite way. Like they're trying to imagine like the causes going back to infinity. They're like, well, how to get started? Oh, there is no ultimate beginner. There's just it's always been things causing other things for all eternity. And you think about how to get started. Well, it's just the causes going back forever.
The uncaused cause just seems submissive and like an acceptance of our lack of knowledge, epistemologically speaking.
Well, I think that the counter argument to that is at a certain point you have to stop. Like suppose you're watching a bunch of dominoes falling, right? And you see, if I can do that, people like they set up dominoes, and you see like, here's like going back, here's the dominoes, and these ones are falling, and then here's a domino here, and you're watching these dominoes, and you see them all falling, and this just sort of goes back to, as far as you can see, there are dominoes falling, and you see some dominoes that haven't fallen yet. They're all lined up neatly in a row, and you say, "Wow, this is a really long domino chain. Where did it start?" And the person that you're talking to that's maybe in charge of the domino chain says, "Oh, no, this is an infinite domino chain. And so but dominoes have just always been falling." And you say, "But surely there's a first domino, and somebody put their finger on the domino, right? There's some."
Where was the potential energy?
Some
thermokinetic
index
energy?
finger.
Yeah,
Maybe
plus
that's
what
not
are the
like-
dominoes? Why the dominoes?
I'll draw that a little better.
Why?
It looks obscene. There. So there's the the hand, the index finger that tipped the first domino that started all the other dominoes going, and this is what's causing dominoes to fall now, right? Cause and effect. So this has got to be the first cause. And without any first cause, there wouldn't be any subsequent causes, and there wouldn't be anything happening now. So, and if someone said, well, there's always been dominoes falling, it just seems like it doesn't make any sense. There would have to be there would have to be some force to start the dominoes falling. Or you think about think about a train, right? So you have a train, a bunch of cars that are connected, and as far as you can see, sometimes it's suppose it's like an infinite train, right? Sometimes I'm down there in the Grove and I'm waiting at the railroad tracks. It seems like I've got an infinite train. So imagine like you've got this train and you see it go along and you're like, wow, I've been waiting here for like a long time. How long is this train? And someone says, well, it's an infinite train. There's just train cars going back to infinity. And I'm like, wow, that must take a lot of power to move this train. And they say, oh no, like what happens is every car moves the car is moved by the car behind it or in front of it. I'm not sure how this would go. Let's see. If it's being pulled, I suppose that would be pulled.
They get pushed and pulled.
Yeah. So you just say, oh, the movement of the cars is just caused by the car preceding it, and there's no real engine pulling the whole thing. Well, it seems like that's kind of weird. You think, well, how's the train moving? And there's got to be some ultimate engine that's pulling the train. Otherwise, the cars wouldn't move. Cars can't move on their own.
I feel like we're trying to solve this problem with like two pretty massive puzzle pieces missing, which is like dark matter and dark energy.
Because those are like huge deciding factors of how the universe was created, but we don't even know anything about it.
We'll get to the physics stuff in a little bit because there's some arguments based on astrophysics about this. One more metaphor. Suppose there's a ball hanging on a chain, and the chain's going up to the ceiling, and you say, well, what's holding up that ball? And you say, well, nothing is. It's just it's being held up by the chain. Well, what causes each chain? What's the chain link hanging from? Oh, well, each chain link is being held up by the one on top of it, right? And it just goes on, and the chain just goes on forever. You think, well, without some force that's holding the chain up, it would just fall to the ground. And say, oh no, it just goes up, into the atmosphere and out into space, and there it is, and nobody's holding the chain. Well, you think somebody's got to be holding the chain, otherwise the chain would fall to the ground. So again, there's this idea that, oh, it's just the links here in the system. So it's not a self-contained system, and it seems like in the universe of cause and effect, we see every time something happens, it was caused to happen by something else that happened before it. And every time that something's created, it's created by something else. So you think about that's sort of the way our universe works. But what about the universe itself, right? So the idea is that something had to cause the universe, something has to explain the universe's existence. And whatever that is, we're going to call it God. So what do you think about that as an argument?
I mean, I feel like the uncaused cause is just like, I can't verbatim give it what you just said, like our deciding to stop here and look around from this point and then choosing to decide from this point in that chain of events. It's like, it is infinite, so we don't really need to go back infinitely. We would get more ultimate answers each time, but at the same time, like, it doesn't ultimately preclude what we have to do from this point to continue going down the chain. So I feel like the uncaused cause is like our escape from the infinite regress to make a decision into the other direction of infinite progress.
I guess it's not like you're like looking at a particular cause and say, okay, I'm not going to go any farther because I'm too lazy, or I'm afraid of what I'm going to see if we keep on going.
Or you understand, like, you'll never stop. It's like you'll end up just chasing the dragon's tail.
Well, I think Aquinas would say, well, it's absurd to think the cause could go back to infinity, because if you have an infinite regress, there's no ultimate cause. If there's no ultimate cause, there wouldn't be any causes now. I suppose it kind of sounds like it's begging the question, because he's saying, well, without an uncaused cause, there wouldn't be intermediate, without a primordial cause, like a first, this is the uncaused cause, or the first mover argument.
Can I use like the GCB, and instead of saying being, just use the word infinite in our place? Like greatest conceived infinite state, and so like that would kind of replace God in that sense. It's just infinite in both directions. Like we know that there's a sense of the infinite in the universe. Like the infinite exists. There are things that are infinite. Like time is relative, and like.
But that doesn't mean it's infinite necessarily.
I mean, the fact that we can conceive of infinity means that infinity should exist. Yeah.
Say that again?
Because we can conceive of the infinite, and an infinite being like the best conceivable being, like infinity is a part of the greatest, and therefore to be better than the conceivability, like there's like a greater infinite in existence than we can even conceive of. So like infinite is a part of the universe, so of course there's an infinite regress, because like that's just something that's just proof that we can't conceive of the infinite as finite creatures. So like, because we can conceive of it, there's got to be a better form of the infinite out there, which would be the infinite regress. I'm trying to blend in something into this right now.
Yeah, so I think Aquinas would say there's a difference between an infinite being, who's the first cause, and an infinite regress, which doesn't make any sense. Like the infinite regress says...
Infinite being doesn't exactly make sense either, because he just goes back into forever too.
Well, he's eternal, but you think of the sort of the prime mover, it's sort of a self
But if he's
existent.
eternal and he's an eternal infinite cause, like he kind of just like answers the question for infinite regress. He just continued to infinitely make decisions back and back and back and back. Even if it was his cause, he still did it all the way back into infinity. He was still the cause of the infinite effect that we see coming out.
Sometimes Aquinas talks about this as being temporal, but he's also talking about like depending on something else for your existence. So so the idea that Aquinas has, and more often he says that this God is a self-existent being who doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. So that's like a hypothesis. So that one hypothesis is self-existent being, which is the source of all other beings, and then the other hypothesis is there is no self-existent being. There's just caused causes, things caused by other things, caused by other things, going on to infinity. And he says that second thing makes no sense whatsoever. So we have to believe in the first thing. We have to believe in the uncaused cause.
We're beings made of matter, and matter is independent. It doesn't need to depend on anything for its existence, because matter just exists. So like,
why
we're
would
a
you say that?
collection of that.
What do you mean by it doesn't depend on? Wait, so
What
where?
does matter depend upon in order to continue to exist? We can't create it or destroy it, obviously. Like, the base forms of matter don't need anything to dictate its existence. It can exist solely on its own accord. It doesn't need...
And that kind of has to go with the like information paradox. With
Hold on, the information paradox. That's a separate thing. You keep on jumping in. We can come back to that, but I want to stick to like one thing at a time. So we're talking about like conservation of massive energy. So the idea is in an enclosed system, matter is neither created nor destroyed. It just transforms form. It just transforms, right?
But it doesn't have to transform.
Right, but like if you have, this is what like the enclosed system, matter is neither, matter is neither created or destroyed. Created nor destroyed, right? But this conservation of mass and energy. Matter is neither created.
We've never seen anything infinite, but they just took a picture of a black hole like 7 months ago or something like that. So they're still sifting through the data, so we might actually get to see an infinite thing for once.
Well, so I mean, like,
Moses
my
did.
understanding
Moses did.
would be like, I know if you touch the surface of a black hole without like burning or being ripped to shreds or like spontaneously exploding, like
Oh yeah.
the second you hit the surface, like your body's gonna get pulled particle by particle down into
Yeah,
the center. But like,
spaghettification.
you're gonna go so fast against the black hole, just moving relative to the speed of light, that you're gonna end up like eliminating time almost completely. So like we watching from here would be like, this guy will forever, he will always
You'll
be
never
at the
reach
surface.
it.
We'll never see you leave the surface. You'll forever be there. But like your particles technically just got pulled apart.
Yeah.
Your perception, I don't know, would it stay?
Because
at the
time for
surface?
you is different to the people that are.
There's no more time.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like we're getting off track here. Even though this physics stuff is actually related in important ways.
So I mean, like it's weird that we can like see a sense of the infinite, but technically, like you're not infinitely on the surface because you did get pulled particle by particle into the center of the black hole. But like
I don't know what you would observe. That's an open question about what you might, what experience you might have. But I want to come back to this conservation of mass and energy. I mean, Aquinas has this idea that things are created, right? But this law seems to say things aren't really created. Like in the universe we observe, this is like the E equals mc squared, right? That's just the mass energy equation. And it says that it gives you a formula for like if you, how to convert mass to energy, right? Like in an atomic bomb. You can calculate the yield of an atomic blast based on this formula. So this shows that when you think you're destroying something, you're really not destroying it at all. You're just converting some mass to energy and releasing that energy. So then maybe, I mean, that might seem like it might be a problem for Aquinas if nothing is really ever created or destroyed. Now, I think Aquinas would say, well, what about the whole universe? Right, so you have this kind of universe here. Does it, where did the universe come from? This is like the Big Bang, and it's sort of, expanding outward, ever faster. So where did this come from? Like where did the little compact bit of matter that created the Big Bang, where did that come from?
I wrote a paper on this. It had to do with, and this is a good theory. I don't know how well it's renowned, but the theory is that if there is 11 dimensions with string theory, the fourth dimension would be able to also have black holes, and a fourth dimensional black hole surface with that paradox that I was talking about where information can't be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
All that information would actually be plastered at its most basic form on the surface of that black hole, which would in turn, on a flat fourth dimensional surface, could relate to the third dimension, which would be our dimension. So you could say that our entire universe is just on the surface of a fourth dimensional black hole.
So
Where did the fourth dimensional black hole come from?
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and it just keeps going and going, and so maybe you could say that there is an infinite amount of dimensions, and it's just an infinite loop of collapsing of black holes and then producing universes on the other side of them.
Well, so, that gets to sort of this oscillating universe theory. So here's a singularity, right? Which is this compact bit of matter smaller than an atom, that all the universe was sort of like, all the matter of the universe was in a singularity that's smaller than a grain of sand, right? Smaller than an atom. And then at some point, for no understandable reason, it began expanding. You have the Big Bang, right? So, and that happened maybe 15 billion years ago or something like that. 14, 13,
Yeah, there you go.
whatever it is. I don't know what's the current, the current thing? What is it? 14? 13.6? 13.8. 13.8 billion years ago.
Yeah, and how long was the singularity?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Where did the singularity come from? We're just talking about the mass expanding. We're not talking about where the mass came from.
It's like the Big Crunch theory, though. Like, it exploded,
Yeah.
gravitated back in to a point, and it's just like
Constantly
jumping, basically.
So
Really
so the
slow
question
heartbeat.
is, so, and this has to do with these two, the open versus the closed universe. So the question is, like, we see the universe is expanding, and it seems to be expanding faster and faster. So then the question is, what's going to be the end game? And so you have just,
I think one of the most important questions is what's making it expand. And once you learn exactly what's making it expand and accelerate, then I feel like that would give you a way better guess to its origin.
What specifically is X-ray radiation? Like, what form of light is that?
What?
It's like black holes. They like shit out X-ray jets from this.
Well, that's Hawking radiation, which is more like, it's more just like black holes decaying, becoming smaller without anything to heat.
So I think that's like Bertrand Russell's
Yeah.
heat death of the universe. Like,
Yeah,
they'll all just get consumed by black holes. That'll just like.
yeah, and then
Radiate back
after
down.
like a googolplex year, all the black holes will have radiated out for
Yeah.
Hawking radiation, and then nothing.
Would it be nothing? Because like
Oh, it's nothing.
it's not radiating out in this like
Yeah.
specific pattern, so it would allow for those particles to like.
Yeah, I
gravitate
wonder what it
together
is
and
actually
start
radiating out with.
so here are two possibilities, right? So the universe is expanding, getting bigger, bigger, bigger. And then at a certain point, there's a question about whether it just keep on expanding or whether gravity is going to cause it to come back together, right? So if gravity isn't strong enough to stop the universe from expanding, it will just eventually peter out, run out of energy,
Yeah.
and you get the heat death of the universe, aka the big chill.
Mhm.
If gravity is strong enough, it will cause the universe to sort of at a certain point stop. Gravity overcomes the initial momentum of the Big Bang, and it begins collapsing on itself, contracting, and then like a cosmic garbage compactor, puts everything back into the singularity, which I call the big crunch. Right, so either way, it doesn't bode well for the universe. And either way, right, you get the question about like, okay, so that's the end of the universe, and so the universe has a beginning and an end. It seems like it's not the sort of thing that could be eternal. Right, it couldn't be something that's just always been here. Because you have the question about what happened before the Big Bang and what we know what's going to happen at the end, but what about before the beginning? And you could say, well, this has always been going on. Well, if you have a process where the universe is kind of winding down and running out of energy, you couldn't say that's an eternal process. That would be like if you have a clock and you can see that, say, halfway wound down, and you can see when it's going to wind down all the way. You might ask, well, how did the clock get wound up in the first place? And someone says, oh, the clock's just always been winding down. Well, it doesn't make any sense, because at some point you could see that clock was all the way wound up, and that must have taken some energy to set it up like that. You can see it winding down. You can see at a certain point it's not going to move anymore. That would be like the big chill. The big crunch, again, you get this big crunch, which is just the way things started out, and you think, well, what caused the Big Bang, and what's going to happen after the big crunch? And so what you were talking about was this oscillating universe theory, which is a way to sort of try to have an eternal universe where you have Big Bang and big crunch. So the idea is that the universe is expanding and contracting.
And it's
Silly.
antiparticles, by the way, that are emitted from Hawking radiation.
So I mean, that's what I was wondering. Like with the big chill, like when we do start to see those X-ray jets coming back together and like gravitating and building stronger gravitational states to pull more matter together, plus its interaction with like the other forms of radiation that it gets, like what we basically have, like it'd still be continuous, but like it would definitely not repeat in the same form that our universe did. So it would be a wholly new universe, but it would still be in a progression.
Yeah, so the idea is that the universe is sort of in the state of expanding and contracting. It's just the matter of the universe has always been here, and it's just doing this big bang, big crunch, big bang, big crunch, just throughout eternity. And that's a way for the atheist to have an eternal universe. The question is what the mechanism is between this and this, and all Sagan says is like, well, it could be like a slingshot effect.
It's getting so hot, you contract it, can't contain itself by gravity, it explodes back out.
Well, there's no physical matter. There's no physical mechanism that would explain why this would happen, right? So So it's just the idea that somehow this momentum going towards the crunch is going to reverse and give you another big bang, but there's no physical theory behind that, right? So it's just a guess.
Yeah.
And there's also another big problem with this, though, is that it looks like this is going to happen, right? So we have like estimates of the amount of matter in the universe, and even counting all the dark matter and the dark energy, it looks like the big chill, the open universe theory is how things are going to go, right? So now just the current evidence shows that we're going to end in the big chill. That's where we're headed towards, the heat death of the universe, and there's just not enough matter in the universe to overcome the momentum for the Big Bang. So think about this in terms of, say, a rocket trying to escape Earth's gravitational field, right? So you need a certain amount of thrust, and so there's there's a threshold where you have enough thrust and you can escape Earth's orbit, right? So you send up your rocket, you need enough oomph to get it to overcome gravitational attraction, go out of the Earth and go out into space. If you don't have enough thrust, then your rocket sort of gets outside and tries to escape, but then it comes back down, right? But if it has enough energy, it can overcome gravity. Well, think about the whole universe is like that, right? So if the universe is expanding at a certain point, you need a certain amount. So there's a certain amount of energy from the Big Bang, and so there's a certain amount of thrust of the universe, of everything moving away from everything else, and then gravity is either going to cause everything to come back, sort of like falling back to Earth like your rocket. Either it's going to collapse in itself, or it's going to overcome the threshold and just keep on expanding until it just kind of peters out. Yeah.
Then wouldn't that conclude that the universe isn't infinite?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Right. So it
then
looks
where's
like.
the edge? Yeah.
Yeah. It just looks like. So you can't have this idea of the oscillating universe doesn't make any sense, because you can't say, well, the universe just expanding and contracting forever, because you don't get the contraction part.
Yeah.
So that makes that cast doubt on the oscillating universe theory, even if you could just have a big question mark, where is it? About what goes on here, right?
Oh yeah.
This slingshot effect. Reminded me of this comic where these two scientists, and one of the guys writing on an equation. He has all these symbols in the middle. He writes, and then a miracle occurs, right? So we don't know what this how this slingshot effect could happen. And if we did, it looks like we're not going to get a big crunch. We're going to end up with the big chill or the heat death of the universe. And on that happy note, let's take our 10-minute break.
So are you saying though that
What?
empty
think,
What's inside that?
what is that?
What's inside
One of my
that? What's
friends,
inside that? What's inside that? It's infinite.
oh, we're back. So,
Maybe.
let's talk some more about God. So we have the open universe theory that says it's just going to expand until it runs out of energy. The closed universe theory says it's going to be like a giant trash compactor, and we're going to get crunched. And if you have a big crunch, you might get a subsequent Big Bang. And if you could explain the slingshot effect, then maybe the oscillating universe theory would work. But it looks like the current evidence is for the open universe, in which case the question about like, well, the universe has a beginning and we can see that it's going to have an end. And so what got it started? You can't say it's always been here or that it didn't come from anything, because you can see it kind of winding down. And so that's like the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics. And this is basically the universe is winding down. It's headed towards minimum enthalpy. So that's just enthalpy is usable energy. And maximum energy, or sorry, maximum entropy. Maximum entropy. Which I suppose we could say disorder or chaos. And enthalpy is just, usable energy. And so the universe is winding down. You can't say, well, it's always been winding down, because then it would have already wound down now. We can see where it started winding down, and we can see where it's going to finish up winding down. And then the question is like, what wound it up in the first place, and where did it come from? And so that's where Aquinas will say, well, that's God is the creator of the universe, and this explains it all. So, and here you can say, again, sort of like, no reason, no ultimate cause. The universe popped into existence for no particular reason. And it just seems kind of absurd when you talk like this, right? So you could say, in the beginning there was nothing, and then for no particular reason, nothing became something, and ever since then there's always been something, and whatever reason, and then we're left up. Human beings evolved from the ooze, and are left to contemplate their existence. And to never know the true cause, because there is no true cause. That just seems to go against reason. So, on the other hand, if you say in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that gives you a reason, an explanation, a cause. And even if you're not going to go with the biblical narrative, you have this idea of a first cause, an ultimate cause, and an explanation. Or, God as an explanation. So what do you think about this? Is another sort of pitch for the cosmological argument based on physics? Can't say the universe has always been here. Had to come from somewhere. Where did it come from? Well, what sort of cause is the sort of cause which could have brought a universe into being? Aquinas would say it was God. Now maybe the question might be like, well, why God? This reminds me of a flashback to an undergraduate class, the Hebraic Hellenic background of Western civilization, and our instructor was a pagan. And one of the lectures was on the Old Testament. It was so we just talked about like classical civilization, and then that he wrote on the board, Jehovah, a good idea? Question mark. Answer, no. Worst idea ever. This is back in the 80s with the moral majority and Ronald Reagan and all this stuff. And anyway, so why God? I feel like that instructor now. Why? So the question here is why?
'Cause it's the only thing that we can think of that's like infinite, or that we can try and imagine is infinite. It's like the greatest thing. That's what we were talking about last class was us trying to imagine the greatest being possible, right. And for something that we don't understand where the start or the end is, like that's the answer. That's like the best answer that we have.
Need to be a god, I guess. It could just be something.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I don't understand why it has to be a being.
Some weird physics thing. Technical term, some weird physics thing. It's quantum fluctuation, right? The primordial quantum fluctuation, which is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. I don't know what this means, but it sounds good. Fluctuation, right? Some like long string of like technical words that you'd say on Star Trek, and some scientists would say, we figured out where the universe came from, and here's what it is, and writes a bunch of equations on the board and says, if you see this is like the origin of matter and universe, and everything is all summed up in this equation, and here's some experiments in our cloud chamber that verifies it. Case solved, right? I suppose you might say there might be some sort of, primordial phenomenon, which has always existed, and is the cause of the universe, and is not, like, you think about what God is, supposed to be.
I feel like a big problem is we try and define the universe in terms of our own timelines, like the way that we perceive time, but time to the universe it is drastic. It goes everywhere. Time can be slow in some areas. It has changing time values. So I mean, how can we measure something that has? We try and measure it on this timeline that we exist on, but yet all of it is constantly having different changing times. Near singularities, near high gravitational objects.
You might argue that the sort of Einsteinian time throws a monkey wrench in the cosmological argument, because it seems to assume like a temporal priority.
Yeah. It's like ours has the priority. Our timeline has priority, but I mean, we're such a small part.
Aquinas is talking about, usually when he talks about like cause and effect, he's talking about, at least in the causal argument, he's talking about something being created from something else. So there he talks about like, a father generates a son, right? So he's talking about the creation of something from something else. In the movement argument, which is separate, he talks about like, the hand moves the staff. And so that's like one thing causes another thing to happen. So one would be like one thing created another, the other one would be one thing causing another thing to happen. So you can think about it as being like beings brought into existence by other beings. Or you can think about it in terms of like in the movement argument, you can think about it as being one event being caused by another event. But in either case, whether you're talking about how, why things are happening right now or why things exist now, you can say, well, what's the ultimate cause? And even if you say, okay, Aquinas will grant you your uncaused cause, the question is it God? Which means, is it like a conscious, intelligent being? Is it, is it, and that's a big question. Part of God is this sort of idea of this spiritual being. The other quality is a moral being, right? That's a big part. And is this really, the Judeo-Christian God? And maybe like a personal being. And maybe this goes along with the consciousness, I suppose. Is it like a personal being? Is it somebody that loves you, right? Is it your Heavenly Father? Heavenly Father. Somebody that cares about you. Somebody that's worthy of worship, right? So, all these things that are part of this concept of God, where it might just be some primordial phenomena that exists outside the universe that causes it and all of the universes, and doesn't have consciousness or intelligence or awareness or morality, and has nothing to do with the Judeo-Christian God that Aquinas believes in. It doesn't love you, it's not a father figure, it's just a thing that exists, that's responsible for everything else. Well, it seems like that wouldn't really be God then. And the other question is like, why, how do we know, suppose it is God, like why just one? And then does, he or they exist now? Like, why not like a bunch of gods? It's like this in Mormonism. Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Genesis was something like the head of the gods called the council of the gods and concocted a plan to create the world, something like that. So like the Mormons are polytheists, and so they believe in many gods. The Greeks were polytheists. Most people tend to think about polytheism as being sort of primitive, I guess. But is there any rational reason why you would think that one God is somehow better than many gods, or why you would rule out like a pantheon of gods? Or even if you don't have like the Greek pantheon, which seemed to mirror the aristocracy of ancient Greece, why not just have like you could have sort of abstract gods of the god of the philosophers, and the question is like why not just one omnipotent being? Why not a bunch of them? Well, you could have millions of gods, I suppose, right? Why one?
Shinto, where there's a god in everything.
Mm-hmm. And then the question is like, how do you know? Suppose it's just one God. How do you know he exists now? Maybe he created the universe and died. It was very sad. This seems a little weak, but at least you might say that there's no maybe logical reason. Now, if God's a self-existent being, maybe that's part of the definition of God being not depending on anything for his existence, and it seems like it might follow that he couldn't be destroyed or killed or something like that. I'm just reminded of the clouds again. We talked about at the beginning of the term. This play by Aristophanes, and Socrates is I think saying that that Zeus has been deposed and he's been replaced by the vortex, and now we're all going to worship the vortex. And you think about maybe that's like what it is. Maybe there's some like primordial vortex that is not the embodiment of justice or the sorts of things that people thought about Zeus, but is just it's just some weird it's some physical phenomena that we don't completely understand. And that's why basically the Greeks had this big festival where they got to make fun of people and say blasphemous things and drink a lot of wine and cut loose. And you can pretty much the rest of the year you had to watch what you said and you had to be respectful. But they had this sort of festival where you just like
That's
the
a nice
birds.
festival.
Yeah, you just go crazy.
We have that.
I guess it's like Mardi Gras or something, right?
Oh, yeah, there you go.
And then I don't know if they had something like Ash Wednesday or what do you know? Is it Ash? I'm trying to think of after Mardi Gras.
Ash Wednesday.
Is before? Is that before?
No, it's after.
It's after, right? So that's when you get all you're sorry for like getting drunk and like doing all those bad things.
There's Fat Tuesday and there's Ash Wednesday.
Okay, that was a Fat Tuesday, right? Yeah. So So with the, yeah, so then you're like, sorry for sins and so on. But, so they just cut loose, but part of this was like this play where Aristophanes just basically saying, God doesn't exist anymore, it's only the vortex, and we're gonna worship the vortex. And there were these philosophers like Anaxagoras, I think is probably who he was mocking, and there's this idea that instead of God, there's just this sort of primordial vat that everything came out of. And maybe that's what it is. Is there any absurdity in thinking that? So why not?
I'd have to find the article, but I was reading about how we can actually like make tiny universes.
Mm-hmm.
It was very complicated to read, but I mean, imagine a civilization a million years ahead of us could have easily produced a universe. I mean, we're kind of already doing that with simulations. Also, have any paradoxes ever been solved?
Well, what do you mean by
Just
that?
any paradox. Any paradox that we found, have we ever solved it?
Well, I think like scientific paradoxes.
Yeah, okay. Because I was thinking about that. If we've never solved any paradoxes, then then maybe there is something going on. It's simulation.
Anaxagoras and Aristophanes. I think he called it the boundless or something. The vortex is a loose translation. All right, so it seems like that's a one problem with the cosmological argument is it seems like even if you grant the first cause or the uncaused cause or the prime mover, it doesn't really get you to God. So it doesn't get you to a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and who's even a conscious being, who's a spiritual being. Maybe you get eternal, and maybe you get creator of the world, but you don't get all those other things that people mean when they talk about God. Then the other problem you have is this idea that it commits the composition fallacy. So if you say each and everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the universe itself has a cause. The question is, can you do that? Can you go from so each and every thing in the universe has a cause, therefore the universe itself has a cause.
What if the universe's cause is to try and understand what the universe is? And the universe just came together to produce people that can actually think about what it is. So it's just the universe trying to understand what it is.
That's that reminds me, I was like in a Unitarian church back in Santa Barbara in the 90s, and this guy gave this sermon called The Wonder of Wonderment. And it's basically like the idea you pitch, which is a common idea in Hinduism, that where, basically the universe is God playing a game or hiding from himself and trying to understand himself. And he fragmented into little bits, and those little bits are us trying to figure it out. And then someday it would all come together and understand. I suppose that might fit in with the big crunch, right? Maybe that's like, as the universe goes into that cosmic garbage compactor, maybe that everything will be one
That's
again.
when everything comes to unity. Yeah.
But I don't know how that would be a cause. It might be a motivation.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but it assumes like a lot of other things about like, the universe being conscious,
Yeah.
which seems questionable.
I mean, the universe is sort of conscious.
In what way?
We're conscious.
Well, we're part of the universe, but
Yeah, so I'm saying that's why a part of the universe is conscious.
right, yeah.
So,
So, and so that's that, and that's the I think it's still the composition fallacy, because some things.
Damn it.
Even if each and everything in the universe would be is conscious, doesn't mean the universe as a whole is conscious, or that there's a universal consciousness. It's just, I suppose it's like the idea of saying each and every person is conscious, therefore humanity is conscious, or there's like a collective conscious.
I'm trying to think of a debate.
collective consciousness. But it could be true that everything inside the universe, like that everything comes from something else inside the universe. But it could also be the universe is a closed system, has just always been here. And maybe the Big Crunch theory is right. Maybe it's Sagan's oscillating universe. And so, but it doesn't seem to follow logically that you can't say, well, because everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the collection of things in the universe it also have a cause. It doesn't necessarily translate. It could be that when you're talking about inside the universe, everything comes from something else, but maybe the universe itself has just always been here. So,
Well, they just got a super good clue on what happened in the beginning of the start of the universe, because they were able to pick up the first light from the first stars. That was like a couple days ago.
oh yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, it was huge. They related it to, imagine trying to hear the wings of a moth, like a hummingbird, flapping in a hurricane. Being able to hear that's what they had to do to basically observe these stars. It's just insane to think about. But it was done with like a 5-foot tall radio antenna they made.
And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's insane.
So now we can kind of get some more details, but we still don't know like what caused the Big Bang. And I suppose you could say, again, you could say, well, something caused the Big Bang, well, something did. And that something doesn't necessarily have to be God. If the universe has always been here, this would have to assume that, it seems like you'd have to assume the closed universe theory, which is contrary to current evidence. But maybe we'll find a bunch of dark energy, dark matter. Maybe that, I mean, we didn't even know about dark energy and dark matter until recently. So maybe we're wrong about the total amount of stuff in the universe, like how massive the universe is. In which case, that would change the equation for how much you'd need for it to collapse on itself. Other thoughts on the cosmological argument, or if I want to start on the design argument. I got to talk about the contingency argument. So this is all talking about the causal argument so far. Let's move on and talk about the contingency argument. So this is the third way, and this is the argument from possibility and necessity. This is kind of like the ontological argument in some ways, because it talks about this idea of a necessary being. Let me just come back here. So this is, again, ways 1 through 2. That's called the causal argument. And this will be an exam question, by the way, just so you know where. So the first two ways, which is the argument from motion and the argument from efficient cause, is where you get the prime mover and the uncaused cause from. Those are called the causal argument. And most philosophers, they lump those two together because they tend to think about motion as a special case of causation. Aristotle separates them out, but it seems like, motion is just a form of change. And change is just a case of causation. So that's why most people put these together as the causal argument. And then the contingency argument, or the third way, is a little different. It's about the fact that nothing lasts forever. You think about that sort of like the nothing lasts forever. Things come into being and they pass away. So if nothing lasts forever and everything in the created universe comes into being and passes away, it doesn't have to exist, then at some point, if you had given infinite time, nothing would exist, right? Because if everything has a limited shelf life, at a certain point in time, all these contingent beings could not exist on their own. And so you just eventually get nothing. but yet we see there's something now, right? So the idea is that you couldn't have a universe of contingent beings. So contingent, and I'll just use the word temporary, but it doesn't necessarily mean the same. A contingent being is a being that didn't have to exist. It's the opposite of a necessary being. So the idea, you couldn't have you couldn't have a universe of contingent or temporary beings, given infinite time, would eventually lead to nothing existing. But something exists. Something exists now. Why does something exist now? Well, Aquinas thinks there must be some being keeping everything in existence, some necessary being on which all contingent beings exist. There's a necessary being which keeps all contingent beings in existence. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anything now. So he says, okay, well, there could be one necessary being, and there could be like an infinite chain of necessary beings, or there could be an ultimate necessary being. Again, it's the same problem as the causal argument. You have an infinite chain of necessary beings, which is absurd, or you have one necessary being, which is God. And he says the infinite chain doesn't make any sense, so you end up with the one necessary being, which is God. So it's the same sort of argument. Instead of talking about cause and effect, he talks about contingency and necessity. So given infinite time, a universe of temporary things would cease to exist. So what do you think about this argument? Any questions about it? Or even the criticisms?
I don't know. I think it's an alright way of looking at it. I mean, I don't know.
It's some of these things are kind of hard to wrap your mind around, like what he's getting at. And this is the idea, like imagine like you have creation and destruction. And so you think about like suppose we have a universe of like 4 objects. And then suppose like object 1, which is the oldest, passes away. Objects 2, 3, and 4 are there. And then object 5 comes into existence. And then object 2 passes away. Objects 3, 4, and 5 are around, and object 6 comes into existence. And so on. You could imagine, like this could just go on forever, right? You could have object 3 would pass away, objects 4 and 5 would still be around, 4, 5, and 6 would be around, and then object 7 would come to existence. So as long as the rate of creation and destruction are the same, it seems like there's always be something, right? So the rate of creation and destruction, and I don't have enough room to write that on here. Let's try that again. Destruction. Yeah, so creation and destruction are the same here. Oops, I'm missing my U. It's a fine art writing with this pen. I need a finer line. I keep on moving it and somebody else keeps on moving it back. Probably the person that prefers green. Okay. There we go. So here, creation and destruction are the same, and it seems like you'd always have a universe of let's see, I think I screwed up one of these. A universe of like three things here. Yeah, one's always gone. So you'd always have a universe of, so here we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I think what I want to do is, here, I'll just do this. You always have a universe of 4 objects, right? 1 goes away, 5 appears. 2 goes away, 6 appears. 3 goes away, 7 appears. Right? There'll always be a universe of, there's always 4 objects. So, this is actually the steady state theory of the universe that was really popular in the 50s, I think early 60s. Sir Frederick Hoyle came up with this idea that the rate of creation and destruction of the universe is always the same. And then he lost out to the Big Bang theory after a while. The empirical evidence pointing towards the Big Bang, the universe actually had a beginning. But you could see, you think about this in the abstract, and you could think about even the Big Bang. If we have the Big Bang and the Big Crunch, you could have an eternal universe. And you could even have a universe of contingent objects as long as the rate of creation and destruction is the same. So for any given object, it didn't have to exist, meaning there was a time when it didn't exist, and there will be a time in the future when it didn't exist. As long as for everything that's destroyed and everything that's created, you would have, you always have something. And then another problem with this is this sort of same criticism, conservation of mass and energy, right? Nothing's really created and destroyed of mass and energy. Nothing is really ever created or destroyed, right? It just changes form. So you convert some energy to mass to energy, and things. There's always something. So the idea that things come into being and pass away, things are born and they die. Plants grow and they wither. Mountains are raised up and fall down. It looks like that, but really what's happening is, things are born from other things and they die. But when a thing dies, it just doesn't disappear. It's decomposed by bacteria and just converted to energy and other forms of matter, right? So it's decomposed and becomes a part of the soil. Or a mountain is just eroded by maybe by, say, weather and flattened out. Or a mountain being raised is just, the plates in the earth pushing together some earth and causing it to come up. And it's not like the mountain sort of exists and doesn't exist, it's just part of the earth. So everything's just being converted back and forth to different forms of matter and energy, but there is there's nothing that's really ever created or destroyed. So that seems problematic with this notion of creation, destruction, contingency, and the idea that things come into being and pass away. And it might just be the universe is the necessary being. This is another problem with this, is this sort of idea of the concept of the necessary being seems to be problematic. You can think about like there's this idea of contingency, like I gave the example, like I'm a contingent being in that as an individual I might not exist had my parents not met, say. Some other individual would exist, but I wouldn't exist. So that's like that. I give a typical example of a contingent being, but maybe it's all contingent beings. It seems the idea of a necessary being just seems that the idea of a being that would have to exist or would have to exist in all possible worlds seems philosophically people say there's a problem with attaching necessity to a being. So you can have this idea there might be like necessary truths, but not beings. So like A equals A, or A is not equivalent to not A, or even maybe, I don't know, modus ponens, right? It's a necessary truth. Or 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? These are all, oops. Seems like these were things that would happen, it would be true in all possible worlds. But the idea that you would have a being which must exist, or a being which exists in all possible worlds or must exist, seems to be a different sort of idea and maybe something that doesn't make any sense. People have poked holes at the idea of necessary being. This is what's behind the ontological argument, right? This concept of a necessary being is problematic in all kinds of ways. And so, see if there's, I don't know if there's anything else about the cosmological argument. Let me just check text. Make sure I didn't gloss over anything. Just as a reminder, tomorrow's the last day to change your grading option to pass, no pass, or letter grade, or bail in the class completely. Friday at 5. Let's see. Well, maybe we should move on to the design argument. All right, we got a few minutes left here, so let's. This is the one that's a little more intuitive. This is also known as the teleological argument. Teleological, this comes from the Greek word telos, which means, end, purpose, or function. And the idea is that if you look in the at the universe, it looks like it's designed, right? What might be an example of something like that looks like the, well, actually, let's let me just start out with that analogy of the watch. Just the watch. So so this is Paley. Oops. Maybe I'll write out the analogy of the watch because it's.
What really bothers me is it still sounds like a marker.
Oh, it does. And
It's just weird.
maybe I should bring in some styrofoam next time. Like a chalkboard. Kind of tired today. I'm dropping things. So Paley says, that imagine I'm going for a walk, and I kick my foot on something in the grass, and I reach down and I see it's a pocket watch, and I admire the workmanship, and I open up the back and I see all the little gears and springs and see all the mechanism and how complicated and intricate it is. And maybe I see a little engravement on the back there. And I admire the workmanship, and I immediately think, I wonder who made this watch. And I admire the craftsman who created it, and perhaps the designer who designed it. And I wonder, how it came to be. I think about maybe the owner. And so I automatically think about the designer. And he says it's different than if you hit a rock, say you kick something and it's just a rock. You don't think, well, who designed that rock, right? You think, well, it's just a rock, and probably wind and erosion, kind of, like there was no grass and there was just rock, and then it sort of cracked open, and then it separated out, and just through purely mechanical forces of the movement of the earth and the plates and extremes of heat and cold caused the rock to crack, and then rain and wind eroded the rock and formed it into this smooth thing. But it's it's just a rock, and here it is, right? I kick it, I don't think anything of it. But if you kick your foot against a watch, that's not going to work. You wouldn't say, well, how did this watch get here? Well, maybe there was I don't know, some bits of metal and glass, and as the wind came, then turned this one to a spring and that one into a wheel, and then they sort of accidentally got jostled together in a storm, and then they kind of stuck together because they got weird little sort of things, and then some glass got seared in the heat, and the sand turned to glass, and then it sort of the molten glass fell on the front of the watch, and all of a sudden and then maybe a lightning bolt came down there and etched, to my Elizabeth, greatest love, Heathcliff, or something, right? That's ridiculous. An intricate watch is different than a rock. And so what's the difference between the watch and the rock?
The watch defies entropy. The rock is a part of entropy, and things that defy entropy are more valuable to us.
Maybe more valuable, but also you don't think a rock doesn't cry out for explanation. You don't think somebody needed to design the rock.
I mean, you could ask where the origin of the rock came from, because it goes much farther back than just on Earth.
I suppose you could, where did the rock come from? Well, the rock was just it's always been a part of the earth. You can ask where the earth came from, I suppose, and say the Big Bang or something, right? But you don't necessarily need to say somebody designed that rock, right?
Yeah.
And even if the rock, might kind of look like, one of your instructors or something like that, right? It's got a little face on it, but you think, it's just like the patterns in the cloud, people are pattern-seeking creatures, and maybe it's kind of weird that it looks like, somebody, but, you could say, well, that's just, I see a pattern there, and given all the rocks in the world, there's a chance that this one rock would turn out to have a face that kind of sort of looks like somebody. But you can't do that with a watch, and it's because it exhibits order, complexity, and purpose. And he also uses this phrase, the fitting of means to ends.
Probably value of time as well, because you see it and someone put work into this, someone put effort into something.
Yeah, and you could say, if aliens from the planet Zontar came down and they picked up this watch in a meadow, they would look at it and they would watch, they wind it up and watch the hands move and observe it, and they could say, oh, well, I understand what this is, because these hands go around this watch twice for every spinning of the Earth on its axis, and then they understand, and that it's uniform, and that about half of a spin is from like 12 hours, and they figure out, okay, this is made to mark off time, and they can tell that the movement of the hands is uniform for time. This is used to mark off the hours of the day, and they'd be able to figure it out without having ever, seen a pocket watch or knowing what it is. So that's the purpose, right? The purpose is to keep time. And then it's got these intricate little parts. And I remember one time I had like a digital watch, and I tried to fix it myself, and I'm like, open up the back with a screwdriver, and it comes off all of a sudden, and the parts go boing. And I'm there with these little parts. This is like a cheap little digital watch. I'm like, or this part goes here, and I'm trying to get all of them in, and I think I was missing a part, and I ended up just buying a new watch because it was, less than $10 at the big box store. So, the wonders of modern capitalism. So, and globalization. So anyway, that if you ever seen, I used to have like I did like a teaching demo for my job here, and I brought this pocket watch, which I have in a box someplace, but it's one of those kind that it's actually like a really big one, and you can see all the gears and springs and all the stuff there.
Got this right here. You can kind of see in the back of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's probably super complex, right?
Yeah.
If even one of those little gears or springs is gone, it won't work anymore. So the idea that this could come together through some random process seems to make no sense.
Horologist, right?
What's that?
Horologist.
I don't know what that is.
The study of time.
Oh, okay.
Is that right? Okay, good.
Oh, right, yeah, or actually I should know that because it's ancient Greek. It's got a Greek root. It means hour. So,
I just wanted to say it.
so the watch is, like at the time, like Paley's time, the watch was sort of the height of technology, right? It's today we might say like it's a smartphone or something. And so you wouldn't think a smartphone came together from like little bits of metal and silicon forming themselves through just random jostling. But you compare like a smartphone or a pocket watch. Maybe let's go back to the pocket watch.
It's amazing to think that a bunch of stones and pieces of matter intricately placed can make such complex things, though.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's pretty fantastic as that meltdown, just random stuff found on the ground, and then all of a sudden now you can connect to the entire world and read everything that's ever been made by humans.
It is pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah, it's wacky, man.
So imagine like a pocket watch. I would even say like a smartphone. You compare that with like a single strand of DNA, right? It's like which is more complicated.
Probably say the DNA.
Yeah, right. So you look at all at nature. You look at the workings of the physical world, the ecosystem, right? Or even any any living thing.
It's just hard for me to understand how everything was able to defy entropy and still produce like life and produce all these extremely complex things, even though the universe is supposed to stray towards, I think higher entropy means more disorder.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It strays towards high entropy, yet we see things that defy that, but are still going towards that way. But somehow have defied it at some point in time to be able to continue at a different path of entropy. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, so it seems that life sort of defies this idea that things should be getting more and more disordered, and in particular, like life on Earth, we see all these intricate interlocking systems in a delicate balance in nature, and all these organisms that have, like you look at like a particular animal, and it's got all these interlocking systems. It's circulatory system, it's respiratory system, it's nervous system, the digestive system. Like all these things have to work in concert. And the same thing with like the, you know, even Paley talks about like the eye, right? So an eye, you have a lens, you have you know, the optic nerve, you have to have an iris to let in the right amount of light, and it's a super complex mechanism. So how could you have those things just come about through random chance? And so
Fall into place.
yeah, so Paley says that in the same way, you have to say that the universe, which is much more complex than a pocket watch, must have a designer. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about the design argument and get right into the problem of evil next week.
That was interesting.